Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Dave.
So let's start with this inflation question. Should this budget increase spending or cut spending?
Well, the starting point for the budget, or the test for the budget, and the most important one, is that it's got to bring down Labor's homegrown inflation, David. That's the overwhelming issue here. To do that, they have to re-establish the fiscal guardrails, the fiscal rules that Peter Costello put in place back in the 1990s to have a structural budget balance, making sure the economy grows faster than spending. But what we've seen from Labor to date is two failed budgets. They haven't delivered this cut in the inflation, the homegrown inflation that we've seen under Labor, described as homegrown inflation by the Reserve Bank Governor, by the way. And the result is that if we have another flop in this budget, Australians are going to pay a very, very high price.
So just back to the question though, should they increase spending or cut spending?
Well, they should be restrained in spending. They should make sure make sure that the economy grows faster than spending, and that's the exact opposite of what we've seen in the last 2 years. So to put this in perspective, we've seen $209 billion of additional spending from Labor since they came to power. So that's over $20,000 for every Australian household. I'll bet there's not many Australian households out there listening to this today who feel as though they've got that benefit.
Yeah.
And yet that's what they've done. There's $2 of spending initiatives for every saving initiative. That's not the answer.
I've heard this $209 billion figure that you've used a few times.
It's in the budget papers, David.
It's a pretty big number.
It is.
To be fair though, this does include the automatic increases in the age pension and other payments.
Sure.
All the spending you supported in last year's budget for job seeker and rent assistance. You're not saying they shouldn't have done that?
Well, we've opposed $45 billion of spending through the budget. We didn't block supply, David. That's not something we're proposing to do, of course. But we've seen spending growing in real terms much faster than the economy in the last 2 years. We have seen a government that loves to spend. I mean, it's their natural instinct.
Well, they say their spending increase is only 1.4%. Yours was 4.1%. It's the average over the last 30 years, 3.2%. So they're saying...
Well, they're going back to COVID-era spending to do that.
So going back 30 years.
Over the last 2 years, what you've seen under this government is spending growing much faster than the economy. And these fiscal rules that were put in place by Peter Costello in the 90s are very, very important. They're part of the Charter of Budget Honesty. And they're essentially rules that ensure that government, when they're putting together their budgets, have a process where they do exercise restraint. That's not what we've been seeing. We're proposing to put those back in. This is a very, very important policy change. Labor took them out when they came into government.
So you'd have a spending rule. What would that look like?
Well, there's a couple of parts to this. One is structural budget balance, not windfall surpluses. So what we've got at the moment is a focus on windfall surpluses.
You'd have a structural balance.
You've got to have a shift over time to structural budget balance. Now, the way to get there is pretty straightforward. You do exactly what Matthias Cormann did from 2013 through to the pandemic, where you made sure that the economy grew at faster than spending. So that's not what we've seen.
You'd have another spending audit, like the Tony Shepherd spending audit.
Well, I'm not committing to that now. We'll talk more about the processes. But the key thing is to get those fiscal rules back in place.
Okay, so
they have been in place. It's really important to emphasise this. They have been in place since Peter Costello. It's only the current Labor government that took them out.
Well, let's look at the spending side.
They did it because they love to spend at exactly the time when we need restraint, because if Australian households are struggling with their budgets and showing restraint in their budgets, it's time for the Australian government to show restraint.
Let's talk about restraint then. Yesterday the government announced more than $11 billion new housing funding. The coalition criticised it because it had no new money. Does the coalition want to spend more?
No, the point here is that the government committed or promised there'd be 1.2 million houses being built. There is nothing in any of what was announced yesterday that tells us we're going to get any closer to that target. And their own National Housing Supply Council has said they're going to fall short of 1 million at best.
So should they spend more?
And many commentators, no, they should just get back to basics. Here's the point.
Spend less.
If you want more manufacturing in Australia, which we all want, if you want more housing in Australia, you've got to get back to basics. So what are the basics that you've got to get right? You've got to get energy policy right. You've got to make sure there's more supply coming into the market. to put downward pressure on prices. You've got to make sure you get your industrial relations right, David, which ensures that we've got productive, competitive workplaces, which are good for both employees and employers.
Right. On another area,
you've got to make sure that government's not getting in the way. You're not over-regulating things. You're getting approvals done, not blocking approvals. These are the basics. If you don't get the basics right, you try to veneer over it with loads of government spending, and it fails.
On defence, the Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie says the coalition will spend more than Labor. Is that right?
Well, I'll make the historical observation that coalition governments have always been able to stay within those fiscal rules that I just described and at the same time deliver a strong outcome for defence. And that's something that we need going into the future. There's no question about that. Look, the geopolitics we're facing right now, there's no doubt, they're very different from even a few short years ago. So you will spend more? You'll spend more? Well, we'll make sure defence gets the capability and resources it needs. We're deeply concerned about whether that's going on.
That's a little bit short of what Andrew Hastie's saying.
Well, I'm not going to give you the election budget details now. But what I'm going to say is that coalition governments have always found ways to make sure defence gets what it needs, and there's no time when that's more important than now. Look, the question for the Australian people is who do you trust to defend Australia in terrible
Well, we're talking about the budget. What about tax cuts?
Well, you were asking about defence. So.
Defence spending, which I'm still unclear whether you're going to increase. But anyway, let's talk about tax. Are you going to offer bigger tax cuts?
Well, we've already committed to an important tax cut, and I think this is it's a crucial indicator of where we're going, which is to restore the accelerated depreciation that was in place for small to medium-sized businesses before COVID. Now, we do need private sector-led investment right now. We don't need government to do the investment. We need the private sector to do it. And the key to that, we've found historically, and we saw it when our time in government, was accelerated depreciation for business. So restoring that back to where it was pre-COVID, hugely important for small businesses who are struggling at the moment, but also hugely important to get the capital investment we need to have that low inflation, strong growing economy that we all want to see.
What about personal income tax? Will you offer bigger tax cuts for personal income tax?
Well, the really insidious effect we're seeing on personal income taxes right now is inflation. We've seen a 23% increase in personal income taxes being paid, and the best way to get personal income taxes back to where they need to be is to put downward pressure on inflation. So that's our starting point. That's the starting point. We'll give you the fuller tax package. Obviously, the accelerated depreciation is an important part of that we've already announced. Obviously, we'll have more to say about the broader tax package. When the government
rejigged the stage 3 tax cuts, you said you would proceed with significant tax reform. And you talked about those at the top end who were going to miss out under the government's changes. Are you now saying you might not?
No, we said we'll deliver a tax package before the next election, which is in keeping with the stage 3 tax cuts. And critical to that is making sure that we don't see the insidious creep of income taxes, which we've seen 23% under Labor, but we've also made very clear we need to see more private sector investment. Right. I mean, this is a crucial differentiation between us and Labor. They think the way to get the economy going over the medium term is to get the government to invest. We think it's to get the private sector to invest.
Well, let's talk about that, this Future Made in Australia plan. What do you think? Where do you stand on this idea? And admittedly, we haven't seen all the detail, but we've seen some of the investments in solar panels, critical minerals processing, a quantum computer. Is this a good idea?
Well, a couple of points I'd make about this. The first is we don't really know what it is yet, David, and you made that comment a few minutes ago, and you're absolutely right. The second point I'd make is if you want manufacturing to succeed in Australia, you've got to get back to basics. I worked in this sector for many, many years before politics. If you don't get the basics right, no amount of government subsidy and investment is going to make up for it. You've got to get your energy.
But is there any case for subsidies, given what's happening around the world with the US, with the Japanese, with the Europeans, all getting into this stuff? Does that make an argument for Australia to do the same?
There's no case for subsidies whilst you're not getting the basics right. You've got to get the basics right. Now, we'll look at each measure as they come forward. It seems to be a grab bag of measures, but the key is to get those basics right.
No, I appreciate your points there.
Well, it's fundamentally important. I mean, we're seeing major manufacturers leaving the country right now. Qenos, who for years I worked very closely to make sure that they could stay in the country. That meant important gas policy, which the government has finally realised is relevant to making sure we've got strong manufacturing in this country.
What about the subsidies we've seen for solar panel makers? Would you strip that away?
Well, again, we haven't seen any of the details on this, and we'll wait and see. We've
quantum computer,
several, yeah, exactly. So we've got $1 billion between the federal and Queensland government being given to a company based out of Silicon Valley. But we've seen no details. We've had two shadow ministers asking questions about this. We haven't got any of the answers. Is it equity? Is it debt? Is it loans? What are the milestones? What's it going to achieve? How's it structured? We don't have any of these answers.
You clearly have concerns about government subsidising the private sector. Would you be willing to subsidise nuclear power plants?
Well, at the end of the day, all generators, if they're going to be successful in delivering affordable, reliable energy and bring down emissions, have got to deliver a return on capital, and that's our approach to energy.
So would you subsidise?
That's our approach to. Well, it's got to be capable of delivering a commercial return, and that's an important threshold test for any investment. And this is where Labor simply doesn't understand investment. I mean, they think they can do a better job of investment in this country than thousands and thousands of experts and professionals out there who do this as their job every day. But frankly, they haven't got a clue. Jim Chalmers has never been involved in this.
Getting back to nuclear, do you think it would deliver a commercial return?
Well, as I say, we're obviously going to have more to say about nuclear in time. But yes, I do, of course. I think any energy source that's going to be able to deliver affordable, reliable energy and bring down emissions at the same time has to be able to deliver a commercial return. And I think it will be able to, sure.
Given the government's now, with its gas strategy, said, we're going to stick with gas for up till 2050 and beyond, does that weaken the case for nuclear?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, I think the important point here is that the government's been mugged by reality when it comes to energy policy, and they've finally realised that we've got collapsing supply in Bass Strait and we need to get more gas out of the ground and more gas into our pipelines. Now, I've been saying this for many years, I've interviewed you about it many times. Yeah. And finally they've realised it. Now, I'm glad to see that they put out a set of principles the other day which are supportive of addressing that issue. I'm disappointed that it was only a set of principles. They've got to get serious about this. We can reduce emissions.
When are we going to see your nuclear policy?
Well, we've already been moving at a rapid pace towards nuclear, which would be one of the most significant changes in energy policy in this country in a long while. There's a sense from some in the commentariat that we're not contrasting with Labor. We're making serious contrasts with Labor right now as an opposition. And they're important contrasts. Nuclear is one of them. Gas has been another.
And another one's supermarkets. I want to just quickly on a couple of other things. Where's this at? The Nationals want the power to break up Coles and Woolies. Have you knocked that off, or is this now Liberal policy as well?
Well, Liberal policy for some time has been to have Liberal and National policy has been to have a mandatory code for the supermarkets. And we've been pushing Labor on that. Belatedly, they seem to be coming to the party. That's great news. And that's a very, very important step forward, making sure we've got a competitive sector. We also have been upfront in saying we're considering further penalties for anti-competitive behaviour in the supermarket sector. We're working our way through that. And
what about a break-up power?
Well, look, we haven't been frightened of divestiture powers in the past. I was the energy minister who put a divestiture power in place.
A big stick
in the energy sector, and we did see reductions in retail prices in the couple of years that followed that. So we have seen that work.
So you're still,
but as I say, we're working our way through that issue. The mandatory code, though, I'm glad to see that Labor's finally seen the light on the importance of doing it.
And the RBA, there's still a disagreement between you and the Treasurer on the Reserve Bank, the plan to have two separate boards. You want all of the existing board members to go onto the new Monetary Policy Board. Yeah. Why is that? What's your concern here?
Well, we want to see a credible, capable, strong and independent Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank's enormously important to making sure we get low inflation and low interest rates in this country, and we want to see evolution, not revolution. Now, we've worked closely with the government on a whole range of issues where we've come to sensible agreement, but a red line for us has been that we don't see sacking and stacking the board. It's very clear that the Treasurer wants to be able to sack and stack the board. We've seen reports just in the last week that headhunters are out spending $100,000 on headhunters to recruit for the Reserve Bank board before they've even put legislation through to change the board structure. So, you know, this tells you how far ahead of themselves the government has got. Now, I wrote to the government, I wrote to the Treasurer back in October on this issue in particular. I'm still to get a reply, David.
When you use the word stacking, are you suggesting he wants to put people on the Reserve Bank or the Monetary Policy Board that will lower interest rates before the election?
Well, what we want to see is an independent Reserve Bank that is effective at fighting inflation and beating inflation on a sustainable basis. And anything that puts that at risk is something that we're going to oppose.
Final one, outside your portfolio, but Liberals have been trying to pin blame on the government, in part, over a violent home invasion in Perth a couple of weeks ago, because one of the alleged offenders was released from immigration detention back in November. Turns out another alleged offender in that incident was released from immigration detention when Peter Dutton was the Home Affairs Minister. Now, Peter Dutton's been demanding the government take responsibility. Will he?
Well, the first point I'd make about this is I know no more about it than what I've seen in the media, and clearly the Labor Party has been pushing this out. The second point I'd make about it is that this was an illegal arrival under a Labor government that gave this person a protection visa. So there's a bit of hypocrisy going on here, but we'll wait and see what briefings we get from the government on it. I make the point that they've released 153 people, and some of those people have been wreaking havoc. And I think that's something the government has still failed to take responsibility for.
If the court documents do back up that, yeah, he was released.
Well, we're speculating on something where I know nothing more than what's in the report.
It'd be a double standard, though, wouldn't it, to say Peter Dutton doesn't need to claim responsibility, but this mob do?
Well, you know, we could start with 153 people being released and the havoc that's flowed from that being something that this government and these two hapless ministers are prepared to take responsibility for, David.
All right, Angus Taylor, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.